In a pivotal moment for India's Indo-Pacific strategy, former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale's latest book, Crosswinds, delves into the early years of India's China policy, providing insights into its formative stages. Vijay Gokhale, who served as the Indian ambassador to China from January 2016 to October 2017 and was the Foreign Secretary of India between 2018 to 2020, brings a unique perspective to the diplomatic chessboard. The book is set against the backdrop of the crucial 1949 to 59 decade and primarily looks at strategic decisions that laid the groundwork for India's current position towards China. In fact, Vijay Gokhale joins me to discuss this further. Thank you, sir, for speaking to us here on NDTV. My first question to you. You said your book is about the decade of 1949 to 59 and how the dynamics between US, UK, India and China shaped India's China policy between those years. Why is it that the decade is so important for us to understand India-China relationship today?
The decade of the 1950s is important for two reasons. One, because we are returning to the situation where China and the United States are in an existential competition with each other. This was the situation in the 1950s, but after the mid-1960s and until 2020, there was a considerable amount of collaboration and cooperation between China and the United States. But what we are now seeing again is increasing competition and rivalry. The second reason why the 1950s is important is because the Taiwan issue dominated that discussion and that competition between China and the United States then, and it appears to be coming back as the central point in their relationship now. Now, the Taiwan Strait issue is important for us then and now because what happens in the Taiwan Strait has a direct impact on India's national security. And by national security, I not only mean the political or geopolitical security of India, but India's economic security as well.
In your book, why do you consider the Taiwan Strait still the most dangerous potential flashpoint? And is there a real threat of military action?
It is anybody's guess whether there will be military action at any time now or in the future. But we have to account for the fact that the prestige and power of the world's two most powerful countries are locked into this small little island. So far as the People's Republic of China is concerned, they consider the island to belong to them, and they find it intolerable that 75 years after the establishment of this new regime, this small island just 100 nautical miles from its coast is not under its control. In a sense, the lack of control over an island which the rest of the world recognizes their sovereignty over in some way diminishes them internationally. So far as the United States is concerned, the continued existence of a democratic government on Taiwan is important not only optically, because America still considers itself the leader of the global democracies, but because Taiwan also plays a very critical part in the defensive mechanism that the United States has maintained since the 1950s, known as the first and second island chains, stretching from Japan all the way down to Indonesia. These are islands where the United States has stationed military forces or has military alliances or alignments with, and which it uses to keep the Chinese, in a sense, bottled up or contained in the inland seas just off its coast, and prevents China from becoming an important player in the Indo-Pacific oceans. So for both, therefore, there is a great strategic value over the island of Taiwan as well as a symbolic one. And since they are the two most powerful countries in the world, tension there is likely to impact the rest of the world.
Is it imperative for India to play a proactive role to prevent a flashpoint over Taiwan?
So as my book Crosswinds shows, the general view that India took no position at all on the Taiwan Strait crisis in the 1950s or had no role to play is wrong if you look at the facts that I have unearthed from the various archives. In fact, the government of India was very clear that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is of great benefit to India, and that India should make an effort to ensure that peace and stability prevails in that part of the world. And therefore, the government of India under Prime Minister Nehru took certain steps. I do discuss in the book that these may not have been entirely successful, but the larger point is that the government of India did believe that when peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is affected, it becomes India's business as well. Now, today, this is even more important because not only does the political instability in the Taiwan Strait cause geopolitical turbulence for India and the rest of Asia, but in addition to that, given the size and scale of the Chinese economy and our dependence upon that economy, it also has huge geo-economic reverberations. For India, let me list these out. 50% of Indian shipping now passes through the Malacca Strait and the Taiwan Strait. So any tension, any confrontation, any conflict in that area is going to have an impact on our external trade. It is also a fact that a lot of Indian industry is dependent on the Chinese for supplying raw materials, intermediate goods, and machinery. Therefore, if the supply chains are disrupted, not only from China, but also from Japan and Korea, if the Taiwan Strait is closed, that too will have an effect on the Indian economy. Third, many of the submarine cables through which India's IT-related or IT-enabled services are operated are anchored in the Taiwan Straits before they cross the Pacific to what is called Silicon Valley. And therefore, any disruption in cable traffic because of the cutting of cables or the destruction of the submarine cables will also have an impact on India's IT industry. And finally, as we all know, most of the semiconductors that India uses in all its digital platforms come from that region. And therefore, short supply of semiconductors or the destruction of semiconductor manufacturing facilities will have a great impact on all of India's digital economy. That includes e-commerce, e-logistics, e-learning, your entertainment industry, as well as even daily supplies such as Dunzo or delivery. Because essentially, almost everything now is being done on digital platforms. So India has to pay attention to what is happening. And that does not mean India has to intervene necessarily. But at least it must be aware, it must be prepared, and it must work with other countries to deter any crisis from occurring in the Taiwan Strait. Encourage the two parties to resolve their issues and to make them aware that any disruption is going to have an impact not just on the two of them, the United States and China, but on all of us.
Mr. Gokhale, how would you describe Prime Minister Nehru's foreign policy in those years when India was taking its first steps as an independent nation? He took the lead in recognizing China even before the West. Would you term that a mistake?
No, I wouldn't term it as a mistake. And of course, there is more than one view about how our first Prime Minister handled foreign policy. My book essentially looked at why we took two decisions. One, to recognize the People's Republic of China without asking for any quid pro quo, which would be normal when two countries negotiate, since a negotiation is meant to satisfy the interests of both. And the second question is why we did not have a stronger relationship with the United States, when the United States had actually supported our freedom movement. Even to the extent of telling the British to give us independence during the Second World War, and was our principal economic donor in the post-Second World War period. And the conclusion I come to is that while Prime Minister Nehru had a very broad strategic vision of India as a country which was large enough and significant enough to play a role in Asia, and that role required us to navigate between the two camps in the Cold War. The strategy and tactics to achieve that objective were lacking. Today, if I were to relate this to today's situation, you see a much better way in which the government of India is achieving the same purpose through what is described as a policy of multi-alignment. In other words, we have good relations with all the major powers, yet we act independently in our interest with a certain degree of autonomy. And this might have been to our benefit if we had built stronger relations with the United States, for instance, in the 1950s, rather than believing that ideologically they were on one side of the divide and the Soviet Union was on the other, and that it served our cause to simply stay in the middle without, in a sense, actually having good relations.
Now, there are several instances of India's border dispute with China in the recent past. What urgent steps must the present government take, according to you, to resolve the situation?
Well, the government was faced with a situation where the Chinese broke a fundamental understanding that both sides had reached, which is that neither side shall use force or threaten to use force to change the status quo. By using force in the Galwan Valley, they actually broke the trust that had developed between the two sides. And I think the government has taken certain steps thereafter to redress the situation. The first, of course, is to build up a credible deterrence on the line of actual control so that such incidents do not happen again. I think the government has also made it clear that until and unless China is prepared to talk about this matter, the relationship will remain abnormal, and therefore what you see is at this stage is not a normal relationship. Thirdly, I think government has also started taking small steps to adjust trade between the two countries, excuse me, so that we are not completely dependent upon them.
So in the current world order with Russia and China aligning, where should India prioritize its diplomatic ties to navigate its Indo-Pacific strategy effectively?
I don't think that India's Indo-Pacific strategy is aimed at any particular country. The objective is really to increase India's own economic, political and security interests, because we have been a maritime power for centuries. And I think we're returning back to the maritime domain as our economy grows and as our national security now requires us to be. Now, what you see as part of multi-alignment is a greater relationship or a partnership that we are building with key partners in the region. The United States, of course, but also Japan, Australia, and ASEAN. In addition, while it is a fact that Russia and China are getting closer to each other, but let us not forget that for 75 years, we have had a strategic partnership with the Russians. The Russians have supported us through provision of defense equipment, through political support at difficult times, and also economically. And therefore, that relationship remains an important one for us. You would have seen the Minister of External Affairs just visited Moscow. President Putin has also regularly said that India is important for him. So I think that relationship is fairly strong. We also have a strong relationship with the European Union. Let's not forget that economically, this is the largest bloc in the world. Investment from there is important for us, and both of us have vital interests in the Indo-Pacific. There too, I think recent steps have been taken to strengthen the relationship. Beyond that, of course, I think India is paying much more attention now to the maritime aspect of its defense. We are moving away from a land-based military to one which is actually far more diverse from outer space to underwater. I think all these changes take time to fully reveal their impact, because these are very expensive financially, materially, even in terms of training human resources. But what I see overall now is a clear change in strategic direction towards the oceans and a greater willingness to develop partnerships based on mutual interest and to redefine what is meant by non-alignment, not any longer in ideological terms, but in terms of our own national interests and concerns.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gokhale, for speaking to NDTV, and wish you all the success with this book.